And that was that as the number of biennales and opportunities for artists to make new work in response to various situations increased, so did the itinerancy of artists. Okay? So I think what Vassiv Kortun and Charles Escher were trying to do through the various different components that they had, through new commissions and residencies and talks and a number of different kinds of structures, was to say we're interested in artists having narrow and deep rather than broad and shallow engagement with this place, Istanbul. But what I was also intrigued with really is how exactly would Istanbul be reflected in the artwork that was produced, and would it necessarily lead to the most significant and the most interesting artworks? We heard this morning that precise question. These interesting structures, this rhetoric about place, firmly locates these festivals and these artists within these cities, but actually does it lead to particularly interesting artworks? Obviously, these kinds of projects, I think it's important to look back briefly on the history of where they emerge out of. And I see it that they emerge out of three key models. One is the Scattered Site International Exhibition, so that really preceded the sort of swell of biennales from about 20 to 15 years ago. Münster is probably the most famous. For those of you who don't know, it's a large-scale commissioning project in the city of Münster in Germany. Happens every 10 years. And most of the commissions are permanent. And I see that being very much one model. The other is, it's really convergence of these three models. So the first is scattered site commissioning projects. The second is public art projects in the vein of somebody like Mary Jane Jacob, who commissioned a number of public art projects in the States in the early 1990s. And the third model is the sort of research-based project program, Locus Pus, Casco Projects, Art Angel, which involves, may or may not involve residencies. So I think all of those models involve an encounter between the artist and a location or a city. Now, I think what's become interesting is that this has occurred at a time at which cultural regeneration has seen the production of new work, new visual artwork, as part of the regenerative process. Okay, so what we see increasingly is this is the panel of curators, okay, for Münster in 2007, and they're at their press conference with the city behind them. Okay, so the commissioning of new work by contemporary artists becomes a signifier for this city being on the map, becomes a cipher of Münster's international status, in the same way as Liverpool for the visual arts, sorry, for the European Capital of Culture, the visual arts was a jewel in its crown, and that included having Tate, Fact, etc., Liverpool Biennial. If I was the curator in charge of some of those other projects, and I saw that somebody was starting to make a work about the Beatles in Liverpool, I'd stop them, you know. I would get them to think through what they were doing with that, just to reflect back to the convergence of those three models, the ways in which artists are increasingly being invited to these places to make new work, occurs at a time at which visual arts is harnessed for urban regeneration, cultural regeneration. So this is a point at which everybody starts to want to have a biennial. The biennial becomes a sort of signifier of one's place in the international circuit, and commissioning is a very important part of that. But let's consider for a moment that we don't all want to be the same sort of curators, and I don't want to get too schematic here, but I want to just think about what kinds of questions this might bring up. And for me, it would be to say, well, how do such works, how do a range of commissions, bearing in mind a lot of these large-scale projects have a huge range of new commissions within them, sometimes up to 50 new commissions. Liverpool Biennial 2004 had 48 new commissions as part of it. How do they coalesce to form a meaningful exhibition? You know, does it matter that they're part of a group exhibition from a curatorial point of view, or could they just occur as solo projects? How do they respond to those places? How do they exist in those places? And then, given that most of these projects are temporary works of art that then are shown elsewhere, how do they then signify out of that context? For example, in Liverpool, most of those works then entered the visual arts economy as we know it, and are then shown in private galleries, commercial galleries, other biennials, other group exhibitions across the world. So how do they signify once they exit that originating context? The other thing is does the emphasis on engagement that there is in much of this curatorial activity lead to a kind of privileging of one medium over another? For instance, if there's an emphasis on social engagement, are we seeing increasingly more socially engaged practice, process-based work that engages, as opposed to studio-based practice? And finally, I think that I want to look at the responsibilities of the curator here, and how we can be responsible to support an artist to make the most interesting and significant work they need to make, and to support the artist, to support the audience to have the best possible encounter with that work. And I'll just read you those two responsibilities in detail. So on the one hand, to support the artist to produce a process or a project or a work that responds to place that's a sort of mutable concept as opposed to a fixed notion of place, with due consideration to the context of the group dynamic, so how will this work operate within the exhibition, that's true to the artist's practice, that's not taking them in a direction they didn't wish to go, but which moves it beyond a kind of replication of previous work. We've all been to biennales or exhibitions where we've just seen a rehearsal of another work made in another city, from city to city to city. And the second responsibility really is to support and engender encounters with the audience, recruiting participants, engaging viewers and collaborators to experience the projects and works as autonomous works within the logic of the exhibition, and really provoking opportunities to new understandings and responses to notions of place, that particular place. Now, I won't go into great detail here. I have got a paper here, but I think given this morning I sort of feel taking the temperature, I don't want to bore you senseless with academic writing, but I want to just refer here to a number of theories which I think, if you're interested in these issues, you might be interested to delve into more detail. One is really a very, very useful book, which is by Mi-Won Kwon, called One Place After Another, which looks at really, she develops an argument through site specificity in the 70s and 80s through to the kind of socially engaged projects that Mary Jane Jacob was involved with in Charleston. And one of the things that Kwon points to, which I think is useful for our consideration, is to say that considering this kind of itinerancy of artists from place to place, the danger is that potential sites and potential communities become sort of predetermined before an artist actually gets a chance to engage. And it's very interesting hearing Lucy's sense of freedom for where you wanted to work and how you wanted to work. Kwon's argument is that so often in many of these curatorial projects, a particular community group is kind of defined, that an artist will work with that group and a project will come out of it. And an agenda is set. So within Liverpool, for example, one might say that a number of the projects had to address a certain social agenda, a certain cultural agenda on behalf of the city. Kwon refers quite in depth, and I won't go into great detail, to Hal Foster's argument in his famous essay, The Artist as Ethnographer, in which Foster talks about the problem of the artist being legitimated by the establishment. So the artist is hired by the institution or the commissioner to go into a particular context and to make it better in some way, or to reflect on it in some way, and that the power dynamics are very much on the side of the artist. And there's very little opportunity for the people that the artist is working with to speak back, if you like, to choose how to change the work.